Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Revenue Throughput Podcast. This is Jose Palomino, your host, and our guest today is Nils Vinje. And Nils runs a company called 30-Day Leadership. And as you can tell by the name, we're going to talk about leadership. His specialty is on B2B leadership framework for leading effective organizations, especially in the B2B space. So if that's you, listen closely as we welcome Nils to our show. Well, welcome, Nils, to the Revenue Throughput Podcast.
Thank you so much, Jose. Wonderful to be here.
Now, you are joining us from Phoenix, right? So very different weather, I assume, than we're getting out here in Philly at this time of year.
Yeah, we're going to hit like 70 degrees or something.
Oh,
today.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, love it in. No, we're in that brutal, it's like, it's not terrible. When you talk to people like in Minneapolis and stuff like that, that's real winter, right?
That's real winter. Yeah.
But, we get 20 degrees but you feel it. It's pretty cold.
I feel that, and I'm not even there.
Well, so Nils, just for our audience, what do you do and who do you do it for?
Yeah. So Jose, my name's Nils Vinje. I run a company called 30-Day Leadership, 30-Day Leadership. And my job is to empower leaders with the tools to confidently handle any situation. We'll get into the leaders in a little bit here, but really, this leadership work is on the back of 10 years as a leadership coach. I'm the author of the best-selling book, 30-Day Leadership Playbook, your guide to becoming the leader you have always wanted to be. And I run a program called the B2B Leaders Academy, where I get to empower leaders with the tools, as I mentioned, to confidently handle any situation.
Oh, fantastic. Well, the whole idea of leadership, organizational leadership, and especially in a B2B context, is something I run into all the time in terms of just my practice working with owners and leaders and so on. So it's a topic I'm really excited to discuss with you here. So when I did my MBA program years ago, we had a big module on leadership, and it was pretty controversial because everybody in the room had a different idea of what leadership meant.
Yep.
So it was I just remember it was like a lot of energy around it. So what's your work, if you have a working definition of how you describe leadership, what does that mean?
Yeah, so I break leadership down into a framework that I call the 4 pillars of leadership. And these are: pillar 1 is leading yourself. Pillar 2 is leading others. Pillar 3 is leading with communication. And pillar 4 is leading with metrics. So my way to take the big, massive world of leadership and break it down into small bite-sized chunks that then I can work with leaders and give them tools to help improve in specific areas is through that framework.
Wow. So that gives a lot of specificity to, like, it gives you kind of a fully orbed view of what leadership is, right?
I think of it as, a scorecard, if you will. So everybody's environment is different. Everybody's situation is different. Everybody's historical, professional life is different. But there are some core foundational, fundamental principles of leadership that I believe are encapsulated in these 4 pillars that are universally applicable, whether you're in an early stage startup in Silicon Valley or you're in a 40-year-old manufacturing company who's in a very different environment. There are still things about how we interact with people and how you lead yourself and how you lead a team and how you communicate the value that you provide that are the same, even though our environments are completely different.
So let me be a little bit cynical here for a moment, right?
Sure.
Because I always like to I always know there's a listener out there thinking, well, what about, right? So one thought, and this is part of, and just recalling the discussion that we had in that class, was leadership as a way to get people to do what you need them to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is that an inadequate description? Does that fall short of what leadership could be?
I think it falls a little bit short because it is told in the context of the leader, as in get what the leader needs done. And a lot of leadership, especially in today's world, is about how to empower the people that work for the leaders, because they're ultimately the ones doing the work. And so it becomes less about the leader and more about the individual. So I would actually say that leadership is really about doing everything humanly possible to ensure that the people that work for you are successful. That to me is my 1-sentence definition of leadership. And then of course, break it down with the framework, but it shifts the focus of success from what the leader wants done to how to make these individuals successful. And everyone's going to have a little bit of a different recipe for how we get there.
Right. But if I'm, let's say I have let's say a classic situation, I'm a sales manager, right? So I have a squad of 12, 13 people working for me.
Yep.
And I'm listening to them saying, yes, I need to empower them to be their best selves and so on. But, my boss didn't get that memo. Right.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
so
as often the case. Yeah.
It doesn't feel that empowering when it comes back to me. It's pretty much, what does he want done or she want done, and how do I get it done for them? So, the aspirational, and I think, very commendable definition you gave, it's still not the norm.
No,
in terms of how people think about leadership, right?
No, it's not the norm. And that's part of the reason why I do what I do is to try to help influence and empower as many leaders as humanly possible for me during, this time when I'm focused on this, because there is nothing greater than the feeling of satisfaction and the feeling of engagement and the feeling of enjoyment when you know where you fit and value you contribute, and you can clearly articulate why you're here. Right. And if all someone does showing up to work is wait for a list of demands from their boss to, just do this and do that and do that and be drilled in and hammered on, there's a relatively short time horizon for which that person would stick around. That wasn't the case always. Right. We're in the middle of the Great Resignation, right, and you're seeing the cracks of leadership appear as giant caverns of people leaving an organization because they don't have to subject themselves to that environment anymore. So if the leaders aren't able to evolve, then guaranteed the turnover is coming or is already there. And that is a huge cost to organizations, big, small, early stage, late stage. It is a massive, massive cost to the organization.
Well, it's interesting. One of our prior guests, and a really sharp guy, Ryan Englund of a company called Core Matters, he helps people hire better, right? That's his focus.
Yeah.
And he says people don't quit jobs, they quit bosses.
That's right.
Because if somebody's an engineer or somebody's a mechanic, they want to be a mechanic, they want to be an engineer, they just don't want to do it there.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, some of the Great Resignation are people actually looking at their lives more existentially, like, do I even want to be an engineer or mechanic? And that's a little different.
Yeah.
But more often, it's you just don't like where you are.
Yeah.
And people will pass up, in percentage terms, a 5% pay differential, 10% to be happy.
Oh, 100%.
Especially if they've made the move for the 5 or 10% in the past to become unhappy, right? So
that's right.
That's interesting. So now,
well, think about this for a second. Think about just the time and the emotional state that someone is in as a result of their work environment. Think about the amount of time that any individual spends in their working world. Okay, at a bare minimum, it's usually at least 40 hours. We all know that oftentimes it creeps way beyond that. But let's just say 40 hours. And 40 hours inside of an environment that is not enjoyable affects every single part of you as a person. Sure. And you take that home. And then all of a sudden, your mood and your attitude and your outlook on everything changes the mood of those who you are around, whether it's a significant other, spouse, kids, family, whatever that is. And then their mood impacts other people. So actually the cost is, far greater than any monetary value, is in terms of just mental health and being in a great place where you feel valued and you feel like you can do a great job and you feel like you're in a position to succeed. And when that's not there, the cost is just tremendous. And I think, part of this resignation has been a wake-up call that you don't have to be in that situation because there are opportunities. Thankfully, part of the pandemic was, yes, work can happen from anywhere.
Right. And that's a big part. And here we are having this cross-country conversation right now.
Yep.
There you go.
Exactly.
So now what's interesting about that, though, is still in all, organizations still have to have objectives and goals and things. Yep. So from a leadership point of view, how do you establish that? You can't design an iPhone by committee somewhere. Correct. There had to be a visionary, somebody. And, I'm not saying we should all lead like Steve Jobs led, because from what I've read, that wasn't necessarily, it was the greatest opportunity, but not necessarily the best experience. Yeah.
I've read the same.
Again, didn't know the gentleman, and maybe he was incredibly wonderful, and he's been poorly written about, but who knows? But the principle is still there, that somebody has to set the path. Yes. And isn't that part of leadership? And how does that manifest, or how does that show up in conjunction with and develop my people, encourage my people, empower my people.
Yes.
If somebody has to set where we're going.
Yeah, absolutely 100%. The course has to be set. And the executive leadership team responsible for setting the course, the CEO in particular, right? Responsible for driving that and getting the buy-in of the executive leadership team. Now, once the course is set, that's where the shift takes place, because then there are a million ways to achieve that course. There are a million ways to go about hitting a sales number. There are a million ways to go about hitting a customer retention number, a support number, whatever it is. So how the leaders who actually work with the frontline people and will ultimately work with the employees, how they engage their people to help fulfill the target that was set, that is where the rubber meets the road. And that is where the greatest opportunity, I think, in the grand scheme of leadership lies, because this is what, frankly, there's just a lot of stuff left over from, many years ago when leadership wasn't thought of in quite the same way, whereas much more authoritarian, much more top down, much more you do exactly what I tell you. And we're just living in a fundamentally different era now.
Hey, pardon the interruption. It'll just be a beat. We want to tell you about something that's really exciting, and it might be very exciting to you if you're the owner, CEO, leader of a B2B company, roughly with $2 to $20 million in revenue, and you feel a little bit stuck. You know what I mean? Sales are a little flat, maybe even declining, challenged. Margins are being squeezed. Sales cycles seem to be lengthening, and lead flow is uncertain. We've designed a program based on over a dozen years of us doing exactly this for many B2B companies. It's called the Competitive Edge Program, and you can learn more about it at valueprop.com/edge. Tells you all about the program. It's a 90-day program, really focused on helping you sharpen your value proposition, aligning your value delivery, making sure your marketing program is doing what it has to do if you're in B2B, which is generate opportunities, and make sure your sales process is tight so that you can convert those opportunities into sales. So with that note, let's get back to an exciting episode of the Revenue Throughput Podcast. Well, also, I think a lot of the work was, I'm not saying simple, because probably nothing was ever simple since, when you have to, if you have to carve out a cave home or something, there's probably details to that. But I guess what I'm saying now, you have obviously the ascent of what we obviously commonly call the knowledge worker, somebody who has deep education, deep awareness of how to do their sphere of whatever they're doing. And they really need a certain amount of autonomy, right? Like if you're working like large spreadsheets for reconciliation, you don't need somebody literally over your shoulder telling you to move from cell A17 to B12.
Right.
That's not what you're looking for. And yet you're right. There are still leaders who still run as if that were the case.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Old habits die hard sometimes. It's tough.
So it's interesting. And by the way, I've seen very cutting edge companies with young leadership run the old fashioned way.
Yep.
And I've seen some very mature leaders who actually have mellowed and actually learn how to do, so it's not just generational, it's something else, right?
And I'm going to posit my idea as to why it happens. I think everybody does learn by observation, and whether it was in a personal experience or hearing about an experience or something else, observations have shaped a large part of what we do. Right. And the people who we were around, the situations we were subjected to, again, personal and professional, all factor into those characteristics that we bring into our leadership. The second piece is that the percentage of people in the professional population or in leadership positions that have had access to leadership training, leadership coaching, leadership enablement, and have been supported by their organization is relatively small. Some industries, like the big organizations that I'm thinking, like the big accounting firms and the big consulting firms, they know how to groom somebody to take them from individual contributor up to a partner or something like that, because they've been doing it for 100 years, right? They're really good at that. They have that dialed in. They know the process. They know the timeline. They know the plan. The rest of the world doesn't always have that luxury of either the time having been around or the resources internally to have built out an entire program to take people from here to there. And a lot of times people can get promoted into a position because they were the best at the role, not because they were the most qualified for a leadership position. And that sometimes can be a challenge to make the transition from individual contributor to leader, if that was the case, because they're essentially given a deep end and pushed in and said, here, figure it out. And they do what they had observed before, which isn't always the most appropriate thing. Again, that comes back to why I do what I do, is because if I can empower leaders with these tools, especially the earlier, the better, we can have tremendous impact, and they can show up in a completely different way than what they may be just normally going to do.
And what you've just described there, Nils, regarding being promoted because you were the best at the skill, it's not limited to, but it's seen there are many more examples like in sales.
Yeah.
So
yes.
your top sales producer becomes sales manager. It's a lousy sales manager, not very good at it.
Right.
And we see this in sports. Some of the great, Phil Jackson, Pat Riley, incredible NBA coaches. I'm an NBA guy. And but they were very good players, but they weren't Michael Jordan level players.
Right.
And those, because I guess it's because they understand what it's like to not necessarily have all the magic tools at your disposal. You have to kind of figure it out. Right. Which I think is just fascinating. So let's take a look at one of the levers of, I don't know if it's levers of leadership, but certainly as you build organizations, is of course compensation, motivation, things like that.
Yep.
Now I know if you go into you read about these tech startups where kids are 27 years old and they became billionaires, right? Unicorns, and there's like 1,000 unicorns now. So it's a pretty amazing thing.
It is.
So you start thinking about, and I started out in tech where you had your stock options. They weren't unicorn stock options, but they were still something you worked for.
Yep.
But take an organization, we talked about it before, a 40-person manufacturing concern that's been around for 40 years.
Yeah.
You don't have those levers of like, hey, work 60 hours a week, 70 hours a week, 80 hours a week, because your reward might be this incredible life-changing event. It's going to be more like you keep your job.
Yep.
What do you see different in motivating and managing your leadership model in the context of something that's fast growing and explosive and exciting versus something that's more like stick to the knitting, safe, secure? What's the big differences? If you're the CEO or somebody in senior management, what should you be thinking about in either of those contexts?
Yeah, I would think about the exact same thing in both contexts. And that is, how can I support the growth and development of the individuals inside my organization? It's going to look completely different inside those two companies. However, the principle remains the same. The number one thing from a human psychology perspective, everyone is driven to do, to varying degrees and different extents, is growth. That's it, right? If we are growing, we feel good. When we stop growing, we start to feel not so good, and we start to question everything. So if you're in a position where you are doing literally the exact same thing you were doing last year, and you have grown zero from last year to this year, you're going to be actively starting to question whether or not you should continue to show up here, or whether or not you should even change careers or do something else. It's a time when all those questions fester when there's no growth. However, if you're engaged in activities that are forcing you to grow, even inside of a 40-year-old manufacturing company, there's still different things that you have not done. And if I was looking at a pool of leaders and finding out, well, how can I broaden their skill set and encourage them to grow by taking on a different part of the org or a different part of the process, or prepare a presentation in a different way. If I can key into those small little, almost micro changes and micro growth opportunities, then I know that I can keep those people engaged and heavily invested in the outcome of this organization. So both companies, the SaaS world and the startup and the manufacturing company, I'd be thinking about the same thing. And it comes down to facilitating that growth of individuals, because when people grow, they're engaged and they want to stick around.
And the difference is, I mean, you're going to attract different talent pool, different experiences, different education.
Yep.
So those growth opportunities might look very different. In manufacturing, it might be, we're going to actively cross-train you in other manufacturing processes, right?
Yep.
But now there's a little pushback to that, and it's this: somebody listening to this saying, well, my guys or my people, they kind of protective over what they're doing. They're not that happy to learn something else or have somebody else learn their job.
Yep.
So when you have like older organizations, and by that I don't mean that the people are older, but they've been there a while, and the company's been the way it's been for a long time.
It's run the same way. Yeah.
It's the same way. It's the way, it's just kind of that thing, right? So how do you, if somebody went through one of your programs and said, boy, I got to do more for my people and so on, What do you think is the big challenge to start injecting that, maybe what might be a real culture shift?
Yeah.
Which I don't think you can do just overnight.
Yeah, no, definitely not overnight, but I think it starts with a simple question. Ask, how do you want to grow over the next 12 months? Ask. Now, some of these individuals may not have been ever been asked that question before. And it's entirely possible that they don't know, and that's okay. But it is important to start the conversation in order to seed the possibility that, and to say, look, I'm curious, how do you want to grow over the next 12 months? We've got a lot of things that we want to improve, enhance, change. There's just, even a business that still runs the same, there's still things that are constantly changing.
Of course.
Right? So how do you want to improve? Is it on the personnel and people side? Is it on the manufacturing? Is it on the relationships with our suppliers? Is it on our global supply chain? There's probably 10 or 20 different areas. And if the leader asks the question and gets some insight, then they can keep that person in mind for a project that's going to come up. Maybe it's in a month, maybe it's 2, maybe it never comes up, but at least they know that, hey, Jose here, I know he really wants to focus on the supply chain piece. So when something comes up and we got problems in our supply chain, let's face it, everybody does these days, like, hey, would be a great opportunity for him to get some exposure and just be part of a team that goes and tackles XYZ project, whatever it is. So I think the just asking first and putting a little bit of the onus on the individual, and this again is the other side of not authoritative. So the organization's not telling the individual where to go. The organization begins to ask, how do you want to grow? Where do you want to improve your skill set? What do you think would be most value? How could you add more value to this organization? Those are really powerful questions. If the individual doesn't know, that's okay. But I can guarantee you the time they spend thinking about that will get the wheels turning, and they will be able to come back with an informed answer and say, you know what, I would really like to dig into the supply chain pieces. So when a project or something comes up like that, I'd love an opportunity to just get some awareness and learn more about our entire supply chain and how we handle things.
Well, you know, and as somebody who's done plenty of like voice of staff kind of work, or just sit in the cafeteria. Yeah. What's interesting is everybody, even the most basic job role, has an opinion about how the company should be run.
Yes. Yes.
And it's not always a good opinion about the bosses presently running it, but but they're like, why aren't we just doing this? Or why aren't we just doing that? So that if you give them, I think, a little bit of freedom, which is what you're suggesting, to like, hey, I actually want to hear what you want to do. It may come in the form of a suggestion for an improvement for the company, as well as, I'd like to do that, you know, and that might be the follow-up question. Would you like to lead that? Not, and I know sometimes you get into this thing where like, well, if you have an idea, then you own it. And that's tough. Now you've raised the bar to a point where somebody's just gonna say, I'm not saying anything.
Yeah. There's a fine line there. That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
So it's interesting between empowering and just like, you know, sloughing off your responsibility into somebody else. Yeah. Wow. Wow. Well, Nils, this has been great. I just love the topic of leadership. You brought a lot for our listeners just to chew on. That one question: how do you want to grow in the next 12 months? It's so basic, but I guarantee you that's not being asked either at all or not nearly enough. And I can absolutely see how that would be an empowering question. Incredibly powerful question. Yeah, I love it. Yeah. So if somebody wanted to know more about what you do, your work, contact you, what's the best way to connect with you? Yeah, so got a special gift for your listeners. I'm giving away free digital copies of my best-selling book, 30-Day Leadership Playbook. You can get one at 30dayleadership.com/book. And 30dayleadership.com is my website. All the details of everything that I do are there. You can find out about the free book, of course, the podcast that I run called the B2B Leadership Podcast, where we pull the covers back on leadership development and have great conversations just like you and I had, all about leadership, and learn how people got into the positions that they're in. Everyone has a fascinating story, and it's wonderful to be able to share that. And then the B2B Leaders Academy, that's where I get to work with leaders across all different types of companies, all different sizes, all different disciplines and industries, and work with them on developing the core skills across this leadership framework that I shared earlier, the 4 pillars, and it's a blast. So 30dayleadership.com. Also hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm incredibly active there. Would love to connect if you're there. Fantastic. Nils, thank you so much for being part of the podcast today. We really appreciate it. My pleasure. Thank you very much. Hey, thanks for listening to another episode of the Revenue Throughput Podcast. If you like this episode and if you like the series, make sure you subscribe below. And also, if you liked it, please do review it. When people are looking for something exciting to listen to, especially the kind of content we're bringing, which is practical insights for B2B companies, this is a place and a free resource that they can take advantage of. Let them know about it with your review. So subscribe, review, enjoy. Thanks again.